Want to get max value from your sets? Keep watching. Your current strategy might be setting back your bottom line. TexasTommo here, and today we're diving deep into poker theory to help answer these 5 questions, hopefully displayed on the screen, about playing sets so you stop leaving chips on the table those glorious times you flop a set. If you're ready to reset your set strategy so it's set in stone and you can sail off into the sunset, we'll stop with that set of puns and jump into the first question. So here we are with Lucid. This is the newer version of Lucid, so a little peek behind the curtains. And our first question is going to be, on what flops should you fast play versus slow play your sets? Let's talk about a button versus big blind situation. So if we do a button versus big blind, and let's pick a random board, just use the feature in Lucid here of a random board. This would be a 5-3-2. We're going to look at c-betting. You see actually a lot of donking here. And one of the things to mention is that in general, sets are going to be relatively similar to your overall strategy. So one thing to think about is that sets are normally one of the strongest hands you can flop. And a way to view them would be, relative to what your range is doing, you would want to probably bet them a little bit more than the rest of your range. So in this case, for example, we can see that the overall, our range wants to bet about 51%. If we were to just click on our sets, we see we're c-betting our sets here about 78%. Now, it's important that there is 22% checks on this kind of board, and also important to recognize that that is with the donking happening. And if you're not playing donks, there's some other impacts that we won't get into today. But we can see a mixture of checking and betting here. Now, if you were to always bet your sets here, you could, against a competent opponent, be making a mistake because they would, for example, be aware that maybe you're much weaker when you check than what you'd see, then your strategy would be in theory. And maybe they would respond by tightening up versus your bets and by being more aggressive when you check on future runouts. So those are things to consider. And so if you're playing a good opponent and you've got a low c-bet board in general, you typically want to be betting a little bit more as a frequency compared to your entire range. Can we find a spot where we shouldn't be c-betting our set? Again, these are all going to be cash games, 100 VB, but of course you can run through and look at your own examples. We'll do a hijack versus button spot. We'll make the big blind fold. We'll choose a random board, and typically in these sort of situations, we have even less of a c-bet. Out position against the button flattening range was a spot we looked at before, where we would have no c-bets in some situations. And in this case, if we were to filter for our sets, there they are. We can see our sets are now c-betting around 58% of the time, compared to an overall betting frequency of about 45% of the time. So that little rule still applies. You basically take your base c-betting frequency, and your sets typically are betting a little bit at a higher frequency. But can we find a spot where we would be just c-betting almost nothing? Let's do a kind of connected board, a Jack 10-9. And here we have 100% checks. Now, if we're checking our entire range here and not c-betting anything, what are we doing with our sets? Hey, we're checking our sets too. It stands to reason that there will be situations where, in theory at least, you should be checking your sets always, and there'll be spots where you should be betting your sets always. And that's kind of easy to hopefully to work out. It just depends on your range. When we're talking about mixed strategies, so boards, which is the majority of boards, where you're betting sometimes and checking sometimes, in general, you're betting your sets at a slightly higher frequency than you're betting the rest of your range. So I picked here a button versus big blind spot. We have an 8-7-4 board, so a pretty dynamic kind of board where, as the big blind, we've flopped a lot of sets. We've gone ahead and checked. The button has gone ahead and c-bet. And we can see here that, again, a similar kind of rule emerges if we're trying to sort of gain a kind of broad heuristic for how we're going to play sets. One thing which we talked about when we're c-betting is take our overall frequencies and then play our sets a little bit more aggressive. We can see here, for example, that we'd be raising combined with our two sizes about 18% of the time. If we take our sets, we're raising combined around 69% of the time. And so again, it stands to reason that if there is check raising on a board and you have sets, you probably want to be check raising those sets at a little higher frequency than your sort of base check raise percentage. If we picked a different board, let's take a very kind of more static low board. And again, similar sort of rule. Here we have 24% at check raising. Our sets are check raising like mad in this situation. Here's another example. We have an ace, queen, 8. This is a spot where the button only uses a bigger sizing here, the biggest possible. The red indicates that these are actions that are never taken in equilibrium poker. You can still see the response, but in general, never taken. Bet 6.65, so this is an over bet relative to the size of the pot. And we can have a quick guess. The big blind would have a set of 8s here. It doesn't have queens or aces because they threw it pre. Can you guess what 8s are doing against the big sizing? Little 3-second quiz. 1, 2, 3. That's right. The pocket 8s are always raising. So it is very hard to find many situations on flops, at least, where you should be slow playing your sets. There's a couple of cases where you're checking your entire range. You shouldn't be donking your sets, for example, as the big blind if you're never donking. You shouldn't be c-betting your sets if you're never c-betting. But in general, as soon as you get these mixed strategies, your sets are very incentivized to very frequently be fast playing often. And in general, I would encourage guys not to look to slow play sets too frequently, other than situations where perhaps you should be checking your entire range. So question 1, on what flop should you fast play versus slow play your set? Very few flops should be slow played. Sets in general follow the flop range frequencies in terms of aggression, but trend much more aggressively. From the button c-betting situations or big blind out of position, it's hard to find many/any flops, but checking our sets on flops is the dominant strategy. Only on some boards when out of position is c-betting your sets the wrong play, And these are flops where we mainly should be checking our entire range. So if the board in question has some betting or raising, there's a strong chance your set should follow into that. Question number 2, how does stack size change your set strategy? Let's have a quick look at some of these spots that we examined, but look at 200 big blinds effective. If we take a low rate cash and go to 200 big blinds, and let's look at a couple of the boards that we looked at earlier. Let's pick our kind of favorite dry boards and just see if there's any difference. Check, we see a range c-bet here. And let's have a quick look at out position with sets. And in general, these are hands that are just as incentivized to raise as they were at 100 BB, and they won't see significant differences from 100 versus a 200 BB spot. I would suggest it's going to be unlikely in many cases if we pick our ace queen 8 board, for example, and we see, again, primarily the big sizing. We see here actually a little bit less in terms of the check raising with our sets in this case. So if we were to filter for our entire range, just to compare the differences, we see that in general, we're just not check raising that much at all, just 3%. I think it makes sense on this kind of board because we don't have the nuts at all, obviously. And whilst we didn't have it at 100 big blinds, it is more of a mistake as you get deeper to get more big blinds in without holding the nuts, right? And so whilst pocket 8 is probably still a hand that we're happy enough to get all the chips in, we have to be more conscious of the fact that it isn't the absolute nuts, even on this kind of flop. And our opponent does have aces and does have pocket queens whilst we don't. And therefore, having a hand even as strong as pocket 8 or ace queen is just not relatively as strong when we're 200 BB effective compared to 100 BB effective. With shallow stacks, there'll be more nuance in terms of when to check raise versus check call. Let's pick a 7-5-2 where we do have sets at least as the big blind. We're going to make the button see what the big sizes. And we see here in this case, our sets are very rarely check raising. Now, I think it'll be really interesting to explore the difference here because this is at 50 BB in an MTT. I think this is a very interesting demonstration of how stack bets actually do impact our set strategy quite a lot. What we have here is actually quite a low SPR. The button has c-bet pot, and already we don't have to, let's say, rush to build that pot in terms of trying to get all the chips in. There's a good chance just with a kind of normal betting pattern that all the chips can go in by the river. And so we'll have less incentive to try and build that pot immediately. There's less urgency with a hand as strong as the set here, especially on a dry board like this. One final thing to mention, if we go to, for example, 25 BB, it gets quite interesting because obviously when we look at the pre-flop, we actually 3-bet all of our pairs. So we can't have a set, in theory, big blind versus button at 25 BB when we're talking about pre-flop. Of course, the button can still flop sets, and so if we were to pick a kind of set kind of board for the button, and again, it's going to follow the same sort of pattern. We see overall 81%, our sets in this case, actually betting exactly the same as our frequency. Having certain blockers with some of your sets has bigger impacts in terms of which hands you want to check versus bet. We're to pick a kind of less c-bet board, let's pick like a queen 8-5, for example. And we were to look at some of the spots, we can see in this case, for example, we wouldn't be c-betting our top set. But if we look at our bottom set, we'd be c-betting that quite frequently. Question 2, how does stack size change your set strategy? Quite a lot. At deeper stacks, we are more careful about check raising sets typically, especially when we do not hold the nuts, as it can become a lower EV prospect to get in a hand like 8s on ace queen 8, big blind versus button at 200 BB, compared to 100 BB. At shallow stacks, we're less aggressive with sets and situations as often there's less incentive to build pots. If opponents are c-betting pot at less than 50 BB stacks, it's reasonable to expect that stacks can smoothly get into the middle without check raises, and we check raise overall less. At 25 BB, we're often not c-betting on dry boards of our sets, and there becomes a greater impact of which of the sets we hold, leading us into our next question. Question 3, how does holding top, middle, or bottom set impact your strategy? Well, we'll stay on this board because I think it's a perfect example, isn't it? Where we see, when we look at our sets, we see our pocket queens is never c-betting. We are checking 100% of the time. When we talk about our middle sets, pocket 8s, we are mixing. And when we talk about our bottom sets, we're betting most aggressively. Now, why would that be? Pocket queens is a better hand than pocket 5s. So why on earth are we checking it at a higher frequency? Well, it's a good question. When we think about the response to our bet, so let's pick, for example, our 1.38. What we can see is our opponent is check raising nearly all of their queen X. So queen 6, queen 7, queen 9, queen 10, queen jack, king, queen are all check raised almost range. Having pocket queens means it's very, very hard for our opponent to have that remaining queen X, right? When we think about our pocket 5s, actually our opponents are not check raising many of the 5X at all. Ace 5, king 5, queen 5, jack 5, 10 5 are almost never check raised. So already I'm hoping you can start to see an impact where having a queen X here really blocks a lot of our opponents' check raises, and these are big check raises our opponents are happy to stack off with, whilst holding pocket 5s unblocks the check raises, and we're more incentivized to just go ahead and bet our pocket 5s to try and get all the chips in. On top of that, let's give our opponent a 5X, right? Here's a little thought experiment. When we're on the button and we think about whether to c-bet or not, how much value can we get from a 5X? Well, typically it's only going to be one street, often. One street before it's considered neutral EV. You see on the flop, we never get a fold from a 5. If we were to pick a turn, just pick a 10 of diamonds turn, and we were to barrel here, already you can see a 5X is pretty indifferent. Yes, some 5X with a gut shot in this case would always call, but a king 5, for example, is basically neutral EV whether it continues or not, and a weaker 5X are mainly folding. If we were to pick a blanker turn to make this a better example, let's pick a 2 of clubs, and then we were to filter on our third pair, you can see our third pair is pretty indifferent. The king 5 just about calls, but everything else is basically neutral EV. So what we can say is there's kind of a clear one street of value from the majority of our opponent's 5x, but beyond that, it doesn't matter too much. Now, if we were to check and we had the same turn come, are we risking missing out on that value? So if we were to take our sets in this case, now you see that we'd always bet our pocket queens, and let's bet our big sizing as an example, or let's bet our small sizing as an example, and let's filter for our opponent's low pairs, third pair in this case, and see always calling the 5x. Again, we don't miss out on value by checking our pocket queens against our opponent's 5x. What it does allow our opponent to do when we check our pocket queens is it allows our opponent to sometimes probe a no equity hand. So this is our opponent's strategy. And if we looked at their nothing, sometimes our opponent is going to pick up equity on the turn that they would have otherwise folded. You take a hand like 4-3. This is a hand that now is very happy from our opponent to bet pretty big at a very high frequency, and is often actually going to be bluffing the river too. And if we were to bet pocket queens on the flop, what happens when our opponent holds that 4-3 off? Well, they're just going to fold it. So we over-realize EV against some of our opponent's range by checking our pocket queens when they pick up some equity, and we can often win a bigger pot, and we don't miss out on too much equity from, let's say, some of the hands that we're going to get called by on the flop anyway. Often they're going to be hands that either probe or going to call a delay as it is. What it allows us to do is over-realize a little bit and also protect our range. If we were to bet all a value hand all the time, our opponent could just probe like crazy and over-realize significantly with their strategy. Now, conversely, when we hold pocket fives, we're less incentivized to do that, because when we hold pocket fives, our opponent is more likely to hold a queen than obviously when we hold pocket queens, and trying to stack their top pair is more important. So at shallow stacks, we want to pay a lot of attention between the kind of sets we hold. Bottom sets in particular, very, very good idea to be check raising them always. Question 3, how does holding top, middle, or bottom set change your strategy? Sometimes a lot, sometimes not a lot. In general, as a rule, bottom sets are some of the best hands in poker to play with lots of aggression. There's very few situations in poker where check raising or c-betting with bottom set is going to be a bad thing to do in theory. Top sets are often a bit more nuanced, and especially at shallower stacks should be c-bet with a little bit more caution. Blocking opponents' stack-off ranges mean that holding top set can often be a lower overall EV prospect when on the button 25 EV versus the big blind compared to holding bottom set. Pocket fives has a higher EV than pocket queens on Queen 8-5, despite being a worse overall hand. Question 4, how should position impact your strategy? So we talked about this a little bit in our first episode of Poker to the Point in our check raising, and position was actually surprisingly unimpactful. And I suspect it's going to be something similar, but let's have a quick look. We'll try and compare a low jack versus big blind to a button versus big blind as an example. We'll pick a King 7-2 rainbow board, and we'll see in the low jack, we're betting basically range, all our sets are betting. If we were to compare that to the button versus big blind on the same King 7-2, and we see that we're betting basically range, all our sets are betting. If we were to look at the big blind response, that would be perhaps more instructive in terms of how we'd respond to a bet range. So the big blind, when we look at the sets in particular, we see our check raising nearly all the sets all the time. In the button versus big blind situation, if we compare that to the low jack versus big blind, pick our King 7-2 rainbow, see the range C bet, and our big blinds is basically betting very similarly nearly all their sets. So I suspect we're going to see very little impact, as we saw in our example at check raising, very little impact in terms of how you want to play your sets in theory. Question 4, how should position impact your set strategy? Not as much as you might think. C-betting and check raising from the big blind and in-position player are very similar, whether playing as the low jack or the button on most boards. Big positional impacts in theory come from when playing as the aggressor out of position, but these are relatively rare in theory and happen far less frequently than playing against the big blind. Okay, and final question is, how do you extract maximum value against different opponent types? So let's stick to the cash 100 VB. So let's go to a random board in a button versus big blind spot. Let's have a look at our c-betting strategy. We can see that our sets, in particular c-betting nearly always, with our pocket queens likewise. But let's focus in maybe a little bit on the response. But let's have a look at our pocket queens. So what we can see here is that pocket queens on this kind of board, in theory, are supposed to bet sometimes, check sometimes, and have different sizes. So what can we make of this? Well, this is situations where your opponents can have a big impact. So one of the good things, and one of the ways you can use Lucid to help you win more chips, and one of the ways you can use Lucid to help you win more chips with sets, is to actually have a little consideration about how will your opponent respond facing different aggressions. Now, if we were to bet with the, let's say, bigger sizing here, let's say you were to bet pop bet, right? Which is happening 25% of the time with our range. Is your opponent going to check raise with some of their bluffs here? We focus on some of the bluffs, and you can ask yourself this the same. Are you check raising with 10-8 facing a pot bet 11% of the time with your nothing? Are you check raising with some King X, King Jack? Is your opponent going to continue with third pair, second pair, top pair? Are they folding top pair ever? Which they should be doing. These are questions to ask that will help direct you whether you're going to perhaps realize a little bit more EV versus realize a little bit less EV. I think one of the things I would encourage guys to do, it's very easy to node lock in your head that, oh, my opponent's going to respond really badly versus the bet. No, the small bet as well. Like, they're never going to fold top pair to a pot bet. So I should always bet top pair with my sets. Brilliant. I think it's harder to try and incorporate the ways opponents will make mistakes when you check. So I think there is often a bias that can result from a lot of theory work where guys get biased into pursuing an action that will see the mistake happen on the same street. Now, if we check, it's much harder to try and figure out the mistakes because there's, How many different turns have we got here? Well, we've got, something like 49 different turn options. So we pick a 4 of clubs. Well, now suddenly we can see that opponents might make a hell of a lot more mistakes. It could be, for example, if you go check on this kind of board, your opponent's going to probe with their draws a lot more frequently. That would be probably something that you'd expect to do, right? So let's say you're playing in your home game and you've called the big blind against the button raise. The board's got queen and 7 and the button has decided to check back. I think there are a lot of opponents who will take a lot of these gut shots and just bet them all the time on the turn, rather than none of the time, which we're seeing in theory. Same with the straight draws. 8-6 is such an easy to bet hand here, isn't it? Same with the flush draws as well. Very difficult to look down and see some of these flush draws and think, oh, I need to check them. If you take a hand like 6-3 of hearts, for example, should be checking a decent amount. Most people are going to bet these a lot more frequently. You can also look at some of the value as well. So like if we take sets, 2 pairs, top pair, second pair, a lot of people are going to bet their 9x now after the flop's gone check, looking to protect their hand. And so if you're going to see on multiple turns, if we pick a different turn, for example, let's pick like, I don't know, a 3 of spades, you're going to see similar trends, 9x mainly check-in. If you think your opponent's going to be putting more money in on a lot more turns, you have a great incentive to then sometimes check with your set on the flop. It's neutral EV anyway, from a theoretical point of view, so you can try and gauge your opponents, right? Are they the aggressive type that loves to put aggression on? Are they the passive type that doesn't really like to put lots of chips in the middle as an aggressive action, but they love to call? If your opponent is the type to just call with high cards on every single flop, you should not really be checking your sets. You should be just going and looking to extract value in all the situations. There is a big player pool out there that just loves to call, and I'm sure you've all played them. And they love to call, and it's very frustrating sometimes when they hit. But at the same time, these are some of your best customers when you flop a set because you just extract value. That's all you're looking to do. Likewise, there are quite a lot of people out there, a big demographic, that loves to apply lots of pressure when they sense weakness. Against those sorts of guys, it's very important that you don't just always bet your sets, because then you're playing right into their strategy's hands. They're applying loads of pressure when you check, and if you're never checking your sets, happy days, they're actually over-applying pressure in areas where they're going to over-realize EV. So how do you extract maximum value against different opponent types? It depends on what your opponent is doing, but the better insight you have in terms of how you suspect your opponent will do, and the better insight you have in terms of how theory will do, and then you can kind of use that as a reference point to think, my opponent will be more aggressive in theory or less aggressive in theory. They're going to call wide in theory, they're going to check raise wider, or they can check raise less. That will give you a good idea of how you can then start to nudge your set frequencies in different ways to make more money. Question 5, how do you extract maximum value against different opponent types? It depends. Against passive, cool, happy opponents, you should be betting and check raising your sets more than you see in theory. Against aggressive opponents that love to apply pressure when they sense weakness, make sure you're not missing some of the theoretical checks with sets in the right spots. Otherwise, you're playing into their strategy's hand. One final little extra bit I'm going to talk about just from a psychology. I think there's a tendency most of us might be guilty of historically, is we love to bet sets. It's a very fun thing to do. I would say on average, if we were to take the population stats, they're going to play sets more aggressively than you'll see in theory. There is a reason for this, I think, which is when we check our sets on the flop, trying to be tricky, and our opponent outdraws us, a lot of the wisdom you'll get from the table is, should have bet your set, mate. You should have protected your hand. And I think that is, whilst well-meaning, can often be quite bad advice. It's very easy to remember the times you check a set, got outdrawn, and lost a big pot. It's very hard to remember the times that you bet your set and just got a fold from a hand that would otherwise have probe and barreled, and you would have earned 2 big chunky bets from a no equity type bluff that your opponent might have made if you just check that set. So take a moment to perhaps recognize within yourself whether you have any certain biases, whether you have any certain risk aversion in terms of wanting to play sets. I think, for example, on this kind of board, it's pretty scary to sometimes check your top set, but in theory, it should happen sometimes. When you look at this queen 9-7, it's very scary to sometimes check your top set, but I think when we looked at the probing strategy of the big blind, there will be opponent types where you're actually going to make more EV checking your top set on this board than by betting your top set on this board. So, are you playing sets wrong? Well, maybe is the answer. In a couple of spots, I'm sure that most of us watching have perhaps been playing our sets suboptimally historically, and hopefully this video was a nice comprehensive review of situations where you could make a few more chips in some spots by checking, and a few more chips perhaps by betting in certain other situations. Maybe next time you get that glorious feeling at the tables where you flop that set, you can think about a couple of these situations that we covered today. Hopefully it's set you on the right way to improving your set profit. We'll finish with that pun, and thanks for watching Poker to the Point. We'll see you in the next one. Cheers.